top stories. 7 jihadists are sentenced to life in prison in Tunisia over attacks which killed dozens of people in 2015. Looking ahead to 2020, US Senator Elizabeth Warren is about to launch her campaign to be the Democratic nominee for president. Hanoi is to host the second summit between Donald Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un later this month. America's envoy is sounding positive.
We have some hard work to do with the DPRK between now and then, and I'm confident that if both sides stay committed, we can make real progress.
This is the scene live in Bordeaux now as Yellow Vest protesters are back on the streets of France again for the 13th weekend in a row. Jihadists have been sentenced to life in prison for their role in the 2015 Tunisia attacks. Militants with guns and grenades targeted tourists across Tunisia, leaving dozens of holidaymakers dead. Here's a reminder of what happened. The first attack was on the Bardo Museum in Tunis, the capital, in March. 22 people were killed. 3 months later, 38 tourists, most of them British, were shot dead at a resort near Sousse. Prosecutors are also appealing against the acquittal of 27 suspects who also stood trial. The BBC's Arab Affairs editor Sebastian Usher explained more about the defendants who were given life sentences.
These are people who were charged with essentially being part of a network which was being run by the man seen as the mastermind, and also, new evidence has come out during the trial of Shamsuddin al-Sandi, based in Libya. And the people who have received the life sentences, 3 for one of the attacks, 4 for the other, essentially were said to have been closely involved with him, both in the lead up to the attack and during it. But others, there were dozens of people who were on trial, and a number of them were actually acquitted. Others received lesser sentences. Always with these big sort of mass trials that come after attacks like this, there's a question mark over how much all of those people who've been brought in are actually closely involved. And some of the defendants, some of those who've been acquitted, said essentially all they had done was discuss the issue amongst themselves.
This was ISIS that claimed responsibility.
Islamic State group claimed responsibility, and the man who's well, either on the run, or there are some reports he was actually killed in a US airstrike a couple of years ago in Libya, Shamsuddin al-Sandi. There does seem very clear evidence. The BBC actually, in a documentary, came out with much of this, that he was behind the attack, that he instigated it, that he gave training to the people who carried it out.
And I said many holidaymakers were killed. This was a target specifically on tourists, a museum and a holiday resort. It was people sunbathing on the beach, wasn't it, in Sousse, who were targeted. Presumably the reason for that, to destabilise the country?
Absolutely. The tourism industry in Libya wasn't doing that well anyway after the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring began in Tunisia, and there was great unrest. So there were, warnings, and travel operators pulled out and people were loath to go. But obviously when these terrible attacks happened, there were travel advisories, from the UK, for example, basically saying all but essential travel should not be undertaken by anyone. That was only lifted a year or so ago. So in the past year, we have seen a return by travel operators. We've seen European tourists going back. We've seen tourists from neighbouring countries like Algeria. So the main centres, Tunis, the beach resorts, have begun to see large numbers back, but many of the other areas which used to see people going, the more adventurous tourists, haven't. And there's still, social instability and political instability in Tunisia to a considerable degree. The jihadism and the terror threat has to some extent been dealt with. A lot of it is to do with essentially sealing off the border with Libya. And in Libya we've also seen that ISIS, which at one point Libya was seen as a place they would move to after they were driven out of Iraq and the other places that they held, that hasn't happened. They've been driven out of their stronghold there. So that's all helped in the battle against jihadism. But there's still been attacks. Security forces have been killed, but the tourist sites have not been hit since then.
That's Sebastian Usher, our Arab Affairs editor. Now, the US Senator Elizabeth Warren is about to officially launch her presidential bid, joining a growing list of Democrats keen to take on Republican President Donald Trump in 2020. The Massachusetts Democrat will make the official announcement in the working-class city of Lawrence before she heads off on a 7-state tour. So what more do we know about Elizabeth Warren? Well, the 69-year-old Democratic senator has always positioned herself on the left of the party. She's a former professor at Harvard Law School, where she taught bankruptcy law. She first emerged as a consumer activist during the financial crisis, and she's been a big critic of big banks and unregulated capitalism. Joining me now is Chris Buckler in Washington. And Chris, I can see a few people getting to the mic where she is about to appear. But just tell us what we can expect from Elizabeth Warren. How's she going to stand out in this crowd of Democrats?
Yeah, the battle for the White House has really begun for 2020 already. It gives you a sense that the Democrats are lining up, and Elizabeth Warren is one of those who be expected to announce herself as running for president. She wants to set herself aside by being someone who really tackles the issue of inequality in America. And I think what you'll hear from her today is that she wants to try and ensure that the rich are taxed and that the poor are better off going forward. And in some ways, you could argue that's one way in which she's trying to set herself aside from Donald Trump. As you mentioned, she's making this announcement in Lawrence, which is a working-class town in Massachusetts, a former manufacturing town. She's going to try and set out and put these policies forward that say she is for the working class, she is for everyday people, as opposed to Donald Trump, who she will try and indicate is for the wealthy and for those who are in more privileged positions. In fact, we always try and work out exactly what's going on at these political rallies sometimes by the songs that they play, and everyday people was the music that's already been played at this rally. Of course, Elizabeth Warren is also someone who has raised the hackles of Donald Trump on more than one occasion. Really, as far as Donald Trump's concerned, he has attacked her time and time again. He has used this nickname Pocahontas for her because she claims Native American heritage. And that has got herself into trouble at some stages as well, because over the last couple of months, he challenged her to take a DNA test to show that she actually did have Native American heritage in her blood. She decided that she would do that, which was then criticized by Native Americans who said that that wasn't a way of determining tribal citizenship. So she has had a bit of hassle around that. But at the same time, she is one of those faces in the Democratic Party who is known to the public, and that is very, very important. And certainly this idea of pushing inequality, of trying to deal with inequality, according to the polls, it is popular. But she's one of a growing field, as you mentioned there, who want that candidature for the Democratic Party. Taking a look, we've already got Kirsten Gillibrand from New York. We've got Kamala Harris as well from California. We've got Cory Booker from New Jersey. And there's also that question about whether or not the former Vice President Joe Biden will run. But for the moment, it's Elizabeth Warren who's going to be taking that stage.
Okay, thanks very much for now. That's Chris Buckler for us there in Washington, and we will bring you that speech when it comes. It's imminent. I can see people at the microphone now. I think it's a long build-up before Elizabeth Warren herself takes to the mic, but we will bring you some of that speech as and when she appears there. Right, let's turn our attention to Paris now. There's some live pictures we can also bring you from there. There have been these yellow vest demonstrations for the last 12 weekends, and this is the 13th consecutive Saturday that people have taken to the streets. Riot police are out in force, as you can see there. They're monitoring the marches. There's been violence at previous protests. There have been several confrontations, and police have been using tear gas today. The demonstrations are taking place in several cities across France. These yellow vest protests are voicing a raft of grievances about the cost of living and the policies of President Macron's government, and they're also demanding more direct democracy. Let's hear from some of them.
For decades now, we have seen that our elected representatives have not been working in the interest of the people. They've been working more for lobbies and other interests. Now they want to transfer sovereignty to Brussels, and I don't want Brussels to decide everything the French have to do.
It's not a referendum story, because what does the referendum mean? Like the big debate, what does that mean? Everyone's talking, but what's the point? It's absolutely useless. It is the institutions that are bad at the moment. Justice is really borderline, and the way that institutions behave, we have to change the institutions, but that's a big job.
When I see poverty in France, when I see the people abandoned by our government, and not just this one, for decades, whether it be Sarkozy and all the others, I say to myself that we must act. I don't believe in the polls much anymore.
Just some of the protesters out on the streets in France today. These are the pictures live in Paris at the moment. You can see the Eiffel Tower there in the background. There have been thousands of people out on the streets, and as I say, riot police out in force on the Champs-Élysées, closely monitoring what's going on. A lot of people wearing signs on the backs of their yellow vests saying we want democracy. All of this started with concerns about fuel tax increases, of course. They've grown to include various issues about the standards of living in France and Mr. Macron's policies in general. Now, the US envoy Stephen Biegun says he's held 3 days of productive talks in North Korea to prepare for the second meeting between President Trump and Kim Jong-un. Speaking after arriving in South Korea, Mr. Biegun said that the US and North Korea still had some work to do before the summit, which will be in the Vietnamese capital Hanoi later this month.
We don't know where it's going to go, but we are in the midst of a conversation with the North, and our discussions were productive. I think you may have seen or may not, because it was just announced in the car here, but the President has announced that Hanoi will be the location for the second summit on the 27th and 28th of February. The President is very much looking forward to taking the next steps. We have some hard work to do with the DPRK between now and then. I'm confident that if both sides stay committed, we can make real progress.
Let's get some of the day's other news now. Activist groups outside China are reporting the death of a respected Uyghur musician in Chinese detention camp. He's believed to have been serving an 8-year sentence. A UN panel said that last year more than 1 million ethnic Uyghurs, including a number of artists and musicians, were being held in detention. The party, which put forward a former Thai princess for next month's election, has withdrawn her candidacy after her brother, the king, intervened. The Thai Raksa Party, which nominated Ubonrat Muhyiddin as its candidate, said it accepted the king's command that, according to the spirit of the constitution, she couldn't run for office even though she had relinquished her royal title. The Trump administration has failed to respond to a request from Congress to provide a report determining who killed the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, a US resident. An administration official said that the president was within his rights to decline the act. The Democrats say that Mr. Trump is violating a law. Stay with us here on BBC World News. Still to come, no ships and now no contract. The UK government cancels a controversial agreement for extra ferries in case of a no-deal Brexit.
There's Mr. Mandela. Mr. Nelson
away in a horse box.
This is BBC World News, the latest headlines. A court in Tunis has sentenced 7 Islamist militants to life in prison for their roles in the deadly attacks on a museum and beach resort in 2015. US Senator Elizabeth Warren is about to launch her campaign to be the Democratic nominee for president. A controversial ferry contract awarded by the UK government to a company with no ships as part of plans in case Britain leaves the EU without a deal has been scrapped. Ministers had faced criticism and ridicule for the $17.8 million deal with Seabourn Freight. The Department of Transport said it cancelled the contract after the company's Irish backer pulled out. Our business correspondent Rob Young reports.
Preparations have been underway for weeks. Dredging started at Ramsgate Port at the beginning of January. The work was meant to ensure the port would be ready at the end of March, should Britain leave the European Union without a deal. The plan was for Seabourn Freight to run regular services to Ostend in Belgium, once it managed to get its hands on some ships. But the company has now been stripped of its contract. The government says Seabourn Freight's main backer has pulled out, meaning it could not meet its contractual requirements. It's thought that backer, Arklow Shipping, has withdrawn for commercial reasons. Ferry services haven't operated from Ramsgate since 2013. The government hopes the port could offer extra capacity should Dover become clogged after Brexit. So it is still possible ferries will once again sail from here. The Department for Transport says it's in advanced talks with other companies to supply freight services. With less than 2 months to go until Brexit, timing is tight.
And I spoke to Rob earlier when he was in Ramsgate.
Now, the government stands by the checks it carried out on seaborne freight when it decided to award this no-deal contract to the company, saying that that was largely contingent on the backing of this Irish company, Arklow Shipping, whose involvement in this deal has only just been revealed. But it's the decision of Arklow to withdraw its backing for seaborne, which has led the Department for Transport to end its contract with seaborne freight. Now, the government and indeed the local authority in this part of the east of England would still like some kind of ferry service to operate here, because the thinking behind the plan is that if there is, as some people fear, delays, even chaos, as some have predicted, at the main port of Dover, which crosses to France, if there's a no-deal Brexit, then the plan is that Ramsgate here can pick up the slack, but of course it can't do that if there isn't a contract with the company.
So what are we expecting? What has the government said about what it's going to do then?
Well, the Department for Transport has said that it is in what it's called advanced discussions with other companies about trying to find more freight capacity on the seaborne routes between the United Kingdom and continental Europe. We don't know what companies the government is talking to, but it may well be that two other operators which have already signed no-deal contracts with the government, DFDS and Brittany Ferries, perhaps they're able to pick up some of the slack that will no longer, that will be there because Seabourn has pulled out of this. Those two companies between them make up 90% of the no-deal capacity anyway, so it's not a huge stretch for them to fill that extra capacity if needed, but the government and the council would like to see some kind of ferry service leave here from Ramsgate at the end of March, because there hasn't been one here since 2013.